I'm continuing with Coleman Cuts the Mustard. Coronavirus, how they deliberately terrified us. This is the true story of how a government threatened, manipulated, and deliberately terrified its citizens for a bug they knew was no worse than the flu. The government I have described is the British government, but I have no doubt that the facts I am outlining here would fit a good number of other countries too. When the coronavirus was first identified, the British government's advisors decided that it was a dangerous infection, and they put it in the same category as rabies, Ebola fever, and a few other deadly diseases. But then, on the 19th of March, the public health bodies in the UK, together with the government's advisory committee on dangerous pathogens, decided that the coronavirus should no longer be classified as a high consequence infectious disease. It's on their files, on their records, you can look it up. So they downgraded it and effectively put it back into the same category as the flu, the common flu that we get every year that kills thousands, millions every year. It's normal. That was on March 19th, 2020. This decision was rather tucked away on the government's website, and although I, Dr. Vernon Coleman, put the decision on my website, the mass media ignored it. I will show you in a minute why they did so. These are the words of Dr. Vernon Coleman. I am only reading them. It was also announced that in future it would not be necessary to manage patients with the infection in special treatment centres only. It was effectively decided that the infection did not need to be regarded as anything more hazardous than the flu, and that it could be dealt with in the same way that flu is managed. I confess I was rather excited by this decision, which totally vindicated my original view based on a mixture of information and experience that the bug was nowhere near as dangerous as it had been advertised. I naively assumed that the government would back off, stop pretending that we were threatened by the plague, and let the country get back to normal. I now feel rather foolish for making that assumption. I should have realised that something bigger was underway from the fact that the government did not publish this decision for 2 days. Kept stum, kept quiet. A bigger game was already in play, and the government was already planning to put huge chunks of the nation under house arrest. And then the emergency bill was passed by a compliant House of Commons, which gave Comrade Boris and his bunch of ministers and advisors more power than any government has ever had in Britain. The House of Commons handed total control of the country to Boris Johnson, Neil Ferguson and Dominic Cummings. What a trio. When the coronavirus bug was downgraded, the government had already been decided to take full advantage of the situation, and the flu-type bug was used as a weapon to trigger a coup that would give the government total control over the people, us, the people, all of us. I have already described many of the astonishing things that have happened. Yesterday, I, Vernon Coleman, was shown a document which made my blood run cold. The document is entitled Options for Increasing Adherence to Social Distancing Measures, and it is dated 22nd of March 2020, 3 days after the bug was downgraded, and it was clear that it was no longer going to put 8 million in hospital and kill 500,000 people, as had been predicted by Ferguson and his chums at Imperial College. The committee responsible for the document was named the Scientific Pandemic Influenza Group on Behaviour, so they presumably knew that we were dealing with a type of flu. The document I am going to quote from was prepared by a bunch of behavioural scientists working for SAGE, a surely appropriate James Bond-like acronym for an organisation which deserves about as much respect as SMERSH or Spectra. The full title of SAGE is the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, and the first thing we need to do when we get our country back is to disband it. I feel qualified to say this. I, Dr. Vernon Coleman, in his words, with all due modesty, the evidence shows that right from the start I have been rather more accurate than SAGE, and if an old man in a chair can produce better advice than a government committee, then it is probably a good idea to get rid of the government committee. Anyway, that's all for the future. Better hurry up, because they're getting worse than ever and it's still the same situation, still the same lies. That's not in his book. What concerns me, Dr. Vernon, at the moment is the document prepared by the Behavioural Science subgroup, a document which shows how the government was advised to control the way we think and to manipulate the way we behave. In the end, I think our politicians and their advisors deliberately set out to create mass hysteria. I think the advisors were perhaps remembering the way teenagers became hysterical when they had watched the film The Exorcist. The document was designed to offer advice to SAGE itself, and here are some quotes which I assure you are not taken out of context. First, under the heading Perceived Threat, the government's advisors wrote, a substantial number of people still do not feel sufficiently personally threatened, and they suggested that the media be used to increase a sense of personal threat. So now you know who was pulling the strings which kept the TV and newspapers building up the scare story. In the old days, this was called propaganda. Actually, we should still call it, propaganda. And so we now know that those inflammatory, scary headlines were written under orders from the government. To sweeten the deal, the government agreed to purchase massive newspaper advertising for 3 months. The government's advertising, paid for with our money, replaced the advertising which was lost because of the lockdown and social distancing. Financially, the newspapers have come out of this very well. I suspect the BBC will be rewarded for its propaganda by having the threats to remove the license fee removed. It is fair to suppose that a few editors will also be expecting knighthoods in the next honours list. And the advisers went on to say, the perceived level of personal threat needs to be increased among those who are complacent, using hard-hitting, emotional messaging. In other words, the behavioural scientists advise the government to make people more frightened of a bug which they knew had just been downgraded to flu level. Second, under the heading Incentivization, the government's advisors wrote, communication strategies should provide social approval for desired behaviours and promote social approval within the community. The other side of that coin, as the advisors doubtless knew, is that people who behaved appropriately and who preferred to be guided by the facts would be demonized and shunned. No one seemed worried about that, and in due course the government deliberately split communities into two. Those who believed all the lies, which is the majority, they were told by the government, and those who sought out the truth, people like me and others, and I'm not alone. Third, under the heading Coercion, the advisors were paid, said consideration should be given to the use of social disapproval, but with a strong caveat around unwanted negative consequences. Fortunately for me, all my life I don't give a damn what people say. I never will. Well, they managed the social approval, but they didn't do much about avoiding the unwanted negative consequences. And they damn well knew that people would be abused. Yeah, you are abused, but some of us can take it. Let's hope that some of the unfortunate souls who suffered because they forgot to go out and clap on Thursday evenings will eventually get over the harassment and the abuse they received from their neighbours. I know a little about abuse. The minute I started exposing the truth about the coronavirus, I was viciously attacked. and unscrupulous attempts were made to destroy my reputation. I have dealt with some of these attacks on my website, and I will deal with more in a special video I am preparing about precisely how individuals are being monstered. Fourth, under the heading enablement, the behavioural scientists pointed out that the public were being asked to give up valued activities and access to resources for an extended period, and suggested that as compensation we should be given access to opportunities for social contact and rewarding activities that could be undertaken in the home, and to resources such as food. I like the last bit. I don't know what the rewarding activities were. I don't think the government ever got around to that, other than the stupid clapping and the drawing of rainbows. But I am grateful to the scientists' suggestion that we be allowed to access resources such as food. Very generous of them. And so, in response to this advice, Boris Johnson's government deliberately terrified the voters because of a flu bug and allowed them access to food. It's no exaggeration to say that Comrade Boris's behaviour has been downright criminal. Here's why. First, hundreds of thousands of citizens have been terrified out of their wits by the propaganda. Since the word pandemic is now fashionable, there will be a pandemic of mental illness and suicide. Note, they changed the criteria for pandemic 12 years ago secretly. Nobody ever knew. It was downgraded from what it really originally meant to something that they were able to use now. That is a fact. You can look that up online. You can actually find that in government papers and stuff. Second, the level of terror is so great that many people are unwilling to go to hospital when they are ill. Parents will not let their children go to school, and teachers will not teach them. The absurd restrictions which will create mental havoc among children are a direct result of all this dangerous gibberish. Millions will not want to go back to work. The economic and social consequences will push Britain back centuries. Civilization has been wrecked for a bug that was downgraded on 19th of March and is no more dangerous than the flu. And third, the people in charge of our hospitals are still following the social distancing rules that seem to have been created because no one listened to the expert advice. Lowering the risk level of the coronavirus, they still seem to believe that the coronavirus is as deadly as Ebola or the plague. Have they too been manipulated into a state of terror? Doctors and nurses must by now know the truth, and yet operations are still being cancelled, and cancer patients are still abandoned and left in limbo by a health system which seems irrationally obsessed by the coronavirus. It is no wonder that the media are busy demonising Sweden, where the government there had no formal lockdown and have suffered far fewer deaths. It is no wonder that the British government has exaggerated the number of deaths from the coronavirus. They must now be desperate that the truth never comes out. The bottom line is simple: to make sure that you are not unduly terrified by your government, and to protect yourself against manipulation. Remember the slogan I introduced for my piece about brainwashing. Distrust the government. Avoid mass media. Fight the lies. I'm going to stop there, but the next section is going to be on coronavirus. Where is the science behind social distancing? The theory behind social distancing is that it will protect people from other folk who sneeze or cough. The lunatics who are currently running the asylum say that we will have to maintain social distancing forever. Forever? Well, that comes next time. Thank you so much for listening. That's gone to 21 minutes. That's enough for now. Thank you for listening. God bless. Have a peaceful evening.